Welcome. I'm Jessica Tietjen, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. I want to welcome back our Evolving to Exceptional listeners to this week's episode of the podcast. We have a fantastic expert, Amy Narishkin, who focuses in the space of cultural intelligence, which is just an incredibly relevant topic. So I'm excited that we get to talk about this today in a world that's particularly polarized, and people are struggling a lot to have some of these more difficult conversations as conflicting perspectives and opinions kind of come together. So, Amy, I'm so excited that you're here to talk about what you do and maybe offer some words of wisdom to our listeners. Before we get into all of that, would you just introduce yourself to our listeners a little bit? What is it that you do and maybe why it is you do what you do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for having me on your show. This is pretty exciting. So cool. And particularly fun is just the title of your program, Evolving to Exceptional. Seems like that's what we're all doing, right? We're all getting better and better. Well, I'm Dr. Amy Narishkin, and I work with organizations and their leaders who want to be confident communicators so that they can attract and retain and engage diverse talent. What else do you need to know?
Maybe a little bit about how you got into this and why it's important to you. Why is working with organizations in this way important to you?
This work absolutely was not on my radar screen. Isn't that so often the case? I started doing this work back in 2014 and kind of bumped into it. I live here in St. Louis, Missouri, and in 2014, if you'll recall, that was the year that Michael Brown was killed here in north part of St. Louis in Ferguson. And there was a lot of quiet, particularly within the white community, around the protesting that was happening by day and the rioting that was happening by night. And that silence to me was deafening. It's kind of an ironic term. But I'm not from St. Louis and I didn't really understand what was happening. So I called a colleague of mine in the doctoral program that I had finished a few years earlier. And Dr. Julia Sims now, he has the title I do. We were both majors in adult education, and he has a church in North City, St. Louis. And it's a Black church that's actually now my church. He was not surprised by my call. I said, "What's going on? I'm not from St. Louis. Why all the quiet within the white community?" And he said, "My white friends actually don't want to talk about it either." And I said, "Well, what about within your community?" And he said, "Well, we're talking about it, but we're so accustomed to tragedy." And I just thought it was fascinating and sad dichotomy. One community not talking about it, another one talking, but way too accustomed to violence. He and I started cross-race discussions in his church. And as we were facilitating those conversations, I noticed that both Black and white, we were all kind of struggling to figure out how to talk with one another. My fellow whites and I didn't have a lot of the language to talk about race because in dominant U.S. culture, you probably know that race, sex, religion, and politics are off the table because they could potentially upset someone. And that kind of puts me and my fellow whites behind the eight ball. We don't have to think about race on a daily basis. So we just don't have any language for it. The average white person knows one Black person and the average Black person knows 8 white people. And that's partly because of demographics, but it's also partly because all of our brains don't typically surround ourselves, as you know, with things that are different from us. And so we're not challenged perspective-wise. What I slowly began to uncover was, though, that this, you had mentioned the word polarization, the kind of thinking from different sides and not understanding other people's perspectives was not uncommon in homes and communities and at work. And it can create for conflict, almost unnecessary conflict, because we don't know how to talk with one another. It was in that setting that I began to, forever the educator, see a curriculum evolving that, oh my goodness, it's no one's fault that we don't know how to talk with one another. It's that we don't have the skills to do it. That's how I came to teach these skills. And often leaders in organizations will call me because they're kind of tripped up over some toxic behavior that's going on in the organization. And I'm like, we got this. I know where to start. So that's how I kind of came into this work over a decade ago now.
Well, and I think it's so fascinating as you describe that story, which is really impactful. I'm from St. Louis, so I was here when that happened as well, and kind of navigating that directly and navigating that within an organizational context and how to support the minority employees and people that we had in our organization as they were navigating a challenging time, and how to kind of have those conversations or what to do. It was an interesting time period for how to navigate that. And I think what's powerful about what you just said, which is important for people to realize, is how much of what we do is biological, is neurophysiological. It's coded in our patterns and practices, not just from our lives, but from centuries of living certain ways, from
Exactly.
survival mechanisms and
Yeah.
ways that we respond to different situations. And so I think there's something a little bit freeing about that when you realize, oh, this isn't about that I've done something bad or wrong, or I'm not as evolved or as good as I should be. And
Right.
instead acknowledging the human body and where the human body is, and that actually I can move beyond that and I can become
Yeah.
more intelligent. So maybe you could help us with I know you kind of talk about cultural intelligence, and you've got a model that you use, but what would you define as cultural intelligence, or how would you explain that to people who've maybe never encountered that or don't necessarily understand what that means?
Yeah, it's a concept that's fairly new. It's been in existence since World War II, and companies went multinational. They needed cultural intelligence. They needed employees actually needed to be able to talk with their colleagues or their clients from Sao Paulo to Shanghai to Chicago. And those cultural differences can inadvertently block communication because you make assumptions the way, as you know, Jessica, brains work is that we all have our biases or our assumptions about other people and other situations. And not our fault. It's just how we were raised. What we prefer is how we were raised, or what we dislike is how we were raised. And when people realize that they have these assumptions, what's really cool is that you can start recognizing, oh, that's an assumption I have about that person. Actually, it's not the whole story. And this is where the beginning of the skills kind of kicks in, is slowing down and taking a moment to notice your reaction and the assumption that came with it. And then just checking to see if you're safe in that situation. Because if you're safe, you need to, if you're not safe, you need to get out. But if you're safe, you can proceed with kind of curiosity and wonder in that conversation and learn more of the person's story. And even if you don't know that particular person's culture's history or context or more about them, you can learn by listening, by asking gentle and respectful questions. And people want to share themselves and they want to share their story. It's really delightful when we shift from knower to learner, and we shift from speaker to listener. How much will be revealed? It's so sweet, and the connections just become more and more genuine. To give you a short definition, cultural intelligence is compassion for a person within their context. So I can, for example, be nice to you all day long, but if it isn't nice for you within your context, it may not land well. So I need to learn a little bit about you in order to be compassionate in a way that's meaningful. That's cultural intelligence. It's as simple as that, compassion for someone within their context.
And how would that differ from maybe people who've had experience with like social intelligence? Is that the same thing, or is it a little bit different?
Okay. Well, tell me what your definition of social intelligence is, and then I can go from there.
Yeah. I mean, when I think of social intelligence, I think of it in terms of my ability to understand and navigate communication and conversation with other humans, right? Other people in connection and collaboration, and to navigate that in a way where I'm really conscious of and aware of, how I'm interacting or how I'm engaging with them. That's kind of my unpolished definition or understanding of
Perfect.
social intelligence.
Well, unpolished or not, it's perfect. I understand exactly what's going on. There's an element in both of what we're talking about, emotional intelligence. It's just
Yep.
self-awareness of your reactions and your responses, your feelings. And underlying both social and cultural intelligence is this emotional intelligence, which means you're getting out of your head and into your heart. And the two are connected. So with some emotional intelligence, then you can develop this social intelligence and be aware of how you're coming across to other people and aware of the impact of your actions on the other person. So I can imagine how important this engagement and this interaction is with social intelligence. And I would suggest that cultural intelligence is perhaps another level or a next chapter,
Mm,
you want to put it, with digging a little deeper and understanding particularly their context.
mm,
That I think would be the significant difference, is that cultural context. Like I had said a little bit earlier in the story about how I got started, when I was talking with Pastor Sims, who's now my pastor, one of the things that I uncovered was when I was talking, he was always talking from my cultural context. And I'd have this idea and I'd present it and, just move in hot with my idea. And he'd be sitting back and just gently kind of nodding his head. And I could tell that, the idea probably resonated with him. And then I'd realize, oh, okay, there it is. There's my dominant white culture. I'm coming in hot with an idea. So in dominant culture in the US, we work from a sense of urgency. We have a task orientation and everything has to be done yesterday. And with this task orientation, we have a to-do list. And sometimes we'll put our to-do list before we put our relationship.
I would say maybe more often than not, we tend to have that
Perhaps.
culturally, have that. I'm not saying that applies to everyone, but I definitely think you can point to that culturally. Yeah.
What you're bringing up is a really important point, is no one person identifies 100% with any one culture. So cultural characteristics are in play. And there's a significant difference between a cultural characteristic and a stereotype. They both start from some element of truth, but a stereotype, when you're stereotyping somebody, you are thinking about their cultural context and you're putting them in a box and you're inadvertently shutting down a conversation because it's not coming up from an intention of exploring and learning. It's coming from an intention of knowing, and I'm done with that, right? Whereas a
Yeah.
cultural characteristics, I'm keeping in mind that African American culture in the United States tends to be relationship oriented, and dominant white culture in the United States, or people that are raised in that white culture, whether or not their skin color matches, have a task orientation, right? And is that anybody's fault? No, right? The task orientation comes from the turn of the last century. All the countries that got industrialized at the same time are task oriented. The Netherlands, Germany, Canada, the UK, the US, we all have a task orientation. In the United States, we just happen to be the most task oriented country in the world, which is why, to your point, we have our to-dos, and sometimes we'll put that, before we'll put the person that we're talking with right in front of us. And
Mhm.
and that can, without knowing that your to-do list can be so important to you, it may not occur to you that you're talking with a person from a Hispanic background or a Black background, or let's see, some other countries. China is relationship oriented. Brazil is a relationship oriented.
Mhm.
Indians are Asian Indians are relationship oriented, right? You're nodding, right?
Yep.
They're going to put the relationship first. And if you don't realize that you're coming from this cultural context, you may not go, take a breath. The way I'm going to relate to them is if I slow down and I put them first.
I love that. I think it's something that a lot of people maybe take for granted. They just exist within their cultures and don't necessarily recognize it as having a concrete impact on their choices, their behaviors, the ways in which they think, feel, and behave. I'm curious, when you work with organizations, what are some of the common challenges that bring them to you to begin with? What are some of the things that precipitate an awareness that says, hey, we need to probably work on this. This is something we need to pay attention to.
So often it's a toxic relationship. It's a person with a set of behaviors that are genuinely concerning or confusing to a leader. I'm actually working with 2 different organizations in 2 different states, one in Missouri and one in Virginia. And in both cases, there's an employee that is genuinely confused to that leader. And there's finger pointing and blaming and shaming going on. Oh, and there's this opportunity to slow down and take a breath and realize that somebody is behaving this way, partly because of their cultural context and partly because of fear. So many times people from historically marginalized groups are afraid to assert themselves because of social isolation or the potential for job loss. And it's real. So they won't necessarily tell you what's going on with them. And so their behavior can be off-putting and confusing. And, why are they telling me what's going on? Historically, they haven't been free to speak up. So often, I was just coaching one of CEO of an organization I'm working with right now. And we were talking about the power differential. He's a white man. He's here in the United States. And he's trying to understand why people aren't more forthcoming with him, with information, right? And not recognizing that he's in a very powerful position running his organization. But we have women on the management team. I understand. And it's not just you talking, right? It's you and the power that's talking. So I said, let me just give you an example. So when I'm in my Black church, right, it's not just me talking, me as a white, talking with a fellow church member, right? It's me and all my history talking. And the reason I have to put this into a cultural context is because historically, when a white person talks with a Black person, historically, they've lost their children. Historically, when a white person is talking with a brown person, they can get deported. So it's not just me talking, it's me and all my history talking. And it's not that I have to say that out loud, I was telling this CEO. It's just that I get to shift from being the knower to the learner and ask gently, what's it about? What are you thinking about? What's been your experience? And then dropping into silence and affirming their experience as legitimate and real, whether or not I agree with it. Not the point is centering the conversation on them. And he started to put it together that when he's talking with a woman, that there's this opportunity to say, no, really, I do want to hear, and kind of pursuing the relationship as opposed to, well, she's just not going to talk. Right? A little bit of difference. Tell me what you're hearing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really interesting. I laugh a little bit because I've worked for a number of CEOs and worked with them directly. And I was also a daughter to a CEO. So I've got kind of this like interesting relationship with it. And having been a senior executive on a leadership team of all male employees and been the sole woman in that space, and the difficulty in trying to narrate why that experience is different and how that experience is different to the other members who can't actually sit in my shoes, right? Can't actually see it from a different perspective, which kind of brings me to, so how, I love how you kind of articulated that. Some of those things you said were not necessarily things I had thought about either, as to some of the baggage of people's experience when they're having a conversation
Exactly.
with a particular person. And our own experiences bring that perspective with it, right? So how do you, when you come in to work with folks and work with organizations, put this into a context in which they can start to develop this awareness to begin to bring, even in that situation of that CEO with female employees, how do you start to bring them along that journey?
Well, it starts with empirical data. And this is what is so important, as you know, in dominant culture, in corporate spaces, empirical data is really important. I shared with you a slide of the 5 stages of cultural intelligence. Do you have that? Do you want to put it up and explain kind of what I'm talking about with this empirical data? While you're pulling it up, I'll explain that when I start with an organization, we start with the IDI, which is the Intercultural Development Inventory. And it's a 50 line item inventory that you and your leadership team, for example, take. So I was working 2 years ago with a hospital group in Southern Illinois and 21 leaders. And they wanted to know how they could be more effective in working with client patients from different backgrounds. And I said, well, let's get the data. Let's find out how you're doing. Well, how do we do that? So each of the 21 leaders took the IDI, this online assessment tool, in their own office. And then what happened was, as soon as they take the IDI, they set up a 60-minute debrief with me. And in that debrief, you get to find out your results. And then we set up some goals for moving from the stage you're in to the next stage. Social intelligence, emotional, isn't something you have, it's something you develop. And we're all somewhere on this continuum. Are we in denial? Are we missing differences? And that's not necessarily intentional. We may have grown up in perhaps a working class community, a white working class community, and we've never been exposed to people who are different, and we just miss those differences. The next mindset is polarization, where you're definitely aware of differences, but you're judgmental of differences. And you're deciding whether they're good, bad, right, or wrong, in or out. It's a rather simplistic mindset and really struggles to see the gray area. The next mindset actually can see the gray area. And the mindset of minimization sees differences, is downplaying them, though, not necessarily recognizing, well, it's not that they don't see or recognize the difference. We're dismissing the differences in order to get along. And then there's the mindset of acceptance and adaptation. Now we're heading into cultural intelligence. More deeply understanding differences is acceptance. And then adaptation is taking that deeper understanding of the differences and being able to adapt your words and actions to show some genuine respect. So the thing is, with these 5 stages of cultural intelligence, 2/3 of the population around the world are in minimization. And this is what we're doing to one another, not just in the United States and not just in your community, but this is the status quo, the norm around the world. And it sounds like, I'll ask you to think of an example, but I'll give you a couple. Mm-hmm. So somebody says to a child who just fell down, get up, you're fine. That's minimization, because you don't actually know if they're fine. Or if your spouse says to you, this too shall pass. We don't know if it'll pass. Or you say to yourself, I just need to get over it. Do you? Maybe you need to sit with it and learn with it. You might hear somebody say, I don't see color. Well, of course we see color. But what we're trying to do is downplay the difference so that we can focus on what we have in common, which is a really good intention. Please don't misunderstand me. It's a great intention, but it hurts. It's kind of like me saying, Jessica, I don't see your womanhood. Well, of course, how you look and how you identify in society has a direct impact on how you're treated and how you move through the world. So how you look is very important. And I think one other example could be if a man says, that's not sexism, is it? Well, it's not his business. If you had been treated that way, then it's sexism. It's legitimate for you. How does that land on you? We can unpack it a little bit more, but how does that land on you, those stages?
Yeah, well, and what I think it's interesting to think that 2/3 of people are at the minimization stage. I'm kind of processing that and thinking back through my experiences. And I think it relates, and I think there's almost a sense of, it's almost a safety response, I feel like, from people.
Yes.
Hey, like, I want to make this not a big deal because I don't want it to be that there's something wrong. Like, I don't want it to be that either wrong with me or wrong with the situation or something I have to change. Like, I want things to stay where I'm comfortable, and I don't want to get uncomfortable. And so if I can minimize it, then I don't have to get uncomfortable. I don't have to accept. Yeah. And I'm reflecting back on an experience where I spoke to some gender-related challenges in the workspace, and the reaction of the participants that were in that room with me And this degree of, well, how many times and how much, and trying to quantify, how many people said it and how often are they experiencing it, and as if you could put kind of parameters around it or box it in, if you would.
And even those parameters around it, boxing it, is another form of minimization. It's just our reality, and it's no one person's fault. It's not a character defect. This is our cultural default. And what's beautiful about what Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you can do better. When you realize minimization's in play, then you can start kind of upending this. It's so uncool to diminish your humanity and the humanity of other people. Humanity, by that I mean we're all broken and beautiful, right? We're all a mess and absolutely lovely in there. And what you're describing is trying to downplay it, is an attempt to just avoid conflict. And avoiding conflict is something that's rampant in dominant U.S. culture. We don't want to experience conflict. We don't want to go through the uncomfortable. What's really lovely, though, is when you're willing to move through the uncomfortable and into getting to know somebody's story, a little bit more about them, you create this genuine human connection.